It was 11:47 on a Thursday night when my phone lit up the bedroom ceiling. I'd been asleep for maybe 2 hours. My hip had been bothering me all week, and I'd finally found a position that didn't ache. And then that phone went off, and I lay there for a second thinking, nobody calls at this hour with good news. It was my son-in-law. I almost didn't answer. Rodney and I had never been what you'd call close, polite at holidays, careful at Sunday dinners, the way you are with someone you're still trying to figure out 15 years in. But my daughter adored him, and she was 7 months pregnant, and so when I saw his name on that screen, I sat straight up and answered before the second ring. Lorraine. He never called me Mum, never called me anything with warmth behind it. Just my name, flat, like I was a contractor he'd hired. I need you to listen to me. I turned on the lamp. Rodney, what happened? Is Kezia okay? Kezia's fine. This isn't about Kezia. He paused and I could hear something in the background, a TV maybe, or music. He wasn't at a hospital. He wasn't panicking. His voice was controlled in a way that told me he'd rehearsed this. I'm calling because we need to talk about the house. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear and I didn't say a word. The house. My house. The house I'd lived in for 31 years, raised my daughter in, buried a husband from. The house with the hydrangeas my mother planted along the back fence, and the kitchen floor I refinished myself after my divorce because I needed something to do with my hands. We've been thinking, he said, and I noticed he didn't say Kezia had been thinking. He said we, the way people say we when they mean I but want the cover of a partnership, that it doesn't make sense for you to be in that big house alone, especially now with the baby coming. We think you should sign it over to us. We'll move in, you can have the guest room, everyone's taken care of. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Long enough he said, Lorraine, you still there? I'm here, I said. We've actually already spoken to a real estate attorney, just to understand the process. It's simple. A quitclaim deed, you sign it, takes about a week to record. The attorney said, Good night, Rodney, I said. And I hung up. I want to tell you something about house before I go further, because if you don't understand what it meant, you won't understand anything that came after. I bought that house in 1993 with money I'd saved for 9 years as a bookkeeper. My ex-husband had nothing to do with it. We were separated by then, and the mortgage was in my name alone. And I want you to know that when I signed those papers, I was 34 years old, and I cried in the car afterward, just sat in the parking lot of that title company and cried because nobody in my family had ever owned anything like that. My mother rented her whole life, her mother rented, and there I was with a deed. I raised Kezia in that house. She learned to ride a bike in the driveway. She left for college from that driveway. When my mother got sick, she came and lived with me in the guest room for the last 8 months of her life. And when she passed, I sat on the back porch among her hydrangeas and talked to her for a long time, the way you do when someone is gone, but you're not quite ready to let the conversation end. Walter, my husband, my second husband, the good one, he moved into that house when we married, and when he died of a heart attack 6 years ago, I stayed. Because the house wasn't just mine anymore. It was his too, in the way that a place becomes part of everyone who loved it. I was 63 years old, retired from 30 years of accounting, and that house was the one thing in this world that was entirely, completely mine, and my son-in-law had called an attorney. I didn't tell Kezia right away. She was 7 months pregnant and her ankles were swollen, and she was exhausted all the time, and I was her mother, and protecting her from things that might hurt her was a habit I'd had for 38 years and wasn't about to break. I told myself I'd wait and see. Maybe Rodney would come to his senses. Maybe he'd been drinking. Maybe I'd misunderstood. But I'm a bookkeeper. I don't misunderstand numbers and I don't misunderstand contracts, and a quitclaim deed is about as plain as it gets. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Beverly Osey, and I've known her for 20 years, since she was a junior associate at her firm and I needed help with Walter's estate planning. I told her what Rodney had said, word for word, because I have a habit of writing things down right after they happen. I'd typed the whole conversation into my phone at midnight after he hung up, or after I hung up, I suppose. Beverly was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Lorraine, he has no legal claim to that property. None. A quitclaim deed only works if you sign it voluntarily. He can't make you do anything." "I know that," I said. "I just want to know what I'm dealing with. You're dealing with someone who did some Google research and thinks that's the same as knowing the law. What concerns me more is the pattern here. Did he mention this out of nowhere? Had there been any previous conversations?" And that was the question that made me sit down at my kitchen table and really think. Because there had been. It had started small. These things always start small. I think that's how they get so far before you notice, because each individual thing seems like nothing, like you're being oversensitive, like you're the problem for even bringing it up. About a year after they got married, Kezia mentioned that Rodney thought it was inefficient for me to have all that space by myself. I'd laughed it off. Then there was the conversation at Thanksgiving 2 years ago now, when Rodney had talked at length about the real estate market in my neighborhood, how the values had gone up, how it was a seller's market. And he'd looked at me the whole time he was talking, like he was making an argument he expected me to respond to. I'd changed the subject to the sweet potato pie. Then there were the comments about my age. Subtle ones, the kind you can't quite call out without sounding paranoid. "You know, Mom," he said Mom to Kezia, but said it in my direction sometimes, as if trying it on. "These stairs are going to get harder. You ever think about a one-story? Or a woman alone in a house this size, that's a lot of upkeep." Or my personal favorite at Christmas last year, "Have you thought about what happens to all this when you're gone?" I was 63. I wasn't gone. I had thought he was just thoughtless. Some men are. They say things without hearing themselves. But that phone call at 11:47 on a Thursday changed my understanding of what I'd been watching, because suddenly I could see the whole picture instead of just the pieces, and the picture was not of a thoughtless man. It was of a patient one. He'd been building toward this for years. I need to tell you about Kezia because she deserves to be understood fully, not just as a character in her husband's story. My daughter is the best thing I've ever done. She's smart, lawyer smart, the kind of person who reads contracts before she signs them, which is something I raised her to do and something I noticed she'd stopped doing somewhere around the time she married Rodney. He had a way of making her feel like her caution was suspicion, like her questions were insults. "You don't trust me," he'd say, and Kezia, who had grown up watching me be too careful and too would back down. She'd changed in ways I'd watched with my hands tied, more hesitant, quicker to apologize. She'd given up the photography she'd loved since college because Rodney said it was expensive for a hobby. She'd stopped seeing her friend Denise because Rodney found Denise negative. She had a good job as a hospital administrator and made excellent money. But when I'd ask her about her savings, she'd get vague in a way she'd never been vague with me before. I hadn't said anything because she hadn't asked, and because she loved him or said she did and maybe she did, and who am I to weigh someone else's love on a scale? But the baby was coming, and now there was a quitclaim deed. The weeks after that phone call were the strangest of my recent life. I went about my days, my water aerobics on Tuesdays and Thursdays, my book club on the second Wednesday of the month, my volunteer shift at the food bank on Fridays, and underneath all of it, I was building something. Quietly, the way I'd built everything in my life, without making a noise about it. I met with Beverly twice. I updated my will, which I'd let lapse after Walter died. I made sure every document that needed to be in order was in order. I also, and I want to be honest is at this because I think it matters, I had a conversation with my doctor. Because I'm 63 and I live alone, and there are people in this world who, when they want something from an elderly person, they start by suggesting that person isn't quite right, that her memory isn't what it was, that she gets confused, that she needs looking after. I wanted documentation that I was, as my doctor put it, sharp as a tack and fully competent, in writing, in her file. I wanted it on record. Rodney had been patient. I could be patient too. It was my neighbour who broke it open in the end. His name is Arthur Pemberton, and he's 71 years old, and he's lived next door to me for 22 years. We've shoveled each other's driveways and shared zucchini from the garden, and watched each other's houses when we travel. And he is one of those people who has the quality, rare and valuable, of noticing things without making a production of them. He knocked on my door on a Tuesday afternoon in March, holding a piece of paper. "You know anything about this?" he said. It was a printout of a real estate listing, my house, my address. Listed for $485,000 by an agent named Spencer Walsh with a company called Meridian Realty. There were photographs, interior photographs, taken from angles I recognized, because I could see the edge of my mother's hydrangeas through the kitchen window in one of them. The listing had been posted 6 days ago. Somebody had been inside my house. The listing said the property was available for showing by appointment. It said the seller was motivated. It gave a contact number for Spencer Walsh. I handed the paper back to Arthur. I thanked him. I went inside, at my kitchen table for about 10 minutes without moving. Then I called Beverly. What we discovered over the next 48 hours was this. Rodney had approached Spencer Walsh approximately 3 weeks after that phone call. He'd presented himself as having authority over the property. Walsh, and I want to be fair here, real estate agents aren't attorneys and they're not title companies. Walsh had listed it without verifying ownership because Rodney had been convincing and had offered a quick sale at a price below market. What Rodney had not accounted for was that you cannot actually sell a property you don't own. There is a title search. There are records. The deed was in my name alone, had been since 1993, and no amount of confidence or well-pressed shirts changes that. Beverly sent a cease and desist to Walsh's firm that afternoon. But that wasn't the part that stopped my heart. The part that stopped my heart was when Beverly called me back at 6 that evening and said, "Lorraine, I found something else. He's filed a petition. He's claiming you have diminished capacity." I didn't say anything. He's arguing that you're no longer competent to manage your own affairs and that as your daughter's spouse, with a child on the way, he should be appointed as your, and I want to read this exactly, your primary decision-making representative in matters of property and finance. The room was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a cardinal was doing something in the hydrangeas. "When was this filed?" I asked. 3 weeks ago. Same week he listed the house. So the phone call at 11:47 hadn't been the beginning. It had been the middle. He'd already been moving, already building his case, already laying the groundwork. The phone call had been an offer. Sign it yourself, make it easy, and maybe I don't have to do it the hard way. I'd hung up on him, so he'd started doing it the hard way. I didn't sleep that night. I'm not going to pretend I did. I lay in the dark and I thought about everything I'd worked for, every hour I'd logged, every dollar I'd saved, the 9 years between my first job and that mortgage. Walter's face when we repainted the living room together, my mother in the guest room asking me to open the window so she could smell the hydrangeas. And I thought about my daughter, 7 months pregnant, married to a man who had filed a legal petition to have her mother declared incompetent. Had she known? I didn't want to believe it. I still don't completely. But I had to ask. I called Kezia the next morning and asked her to come over. Just her, I said. I need to talk to you alone. She looked tired, the way pregnant women look tired, a deep tired that sits behind the eyes. She had a travel mug of decaf and she hugged me at the door the way she always has, both arms, her chin on my shoulder, and I held on a little longer than usual. We sat at the kitchen table. I put Beverly's paperwork in front of her, the listing printout that Arthur had brought me, the petition documents. I watched her read. She got very still about halfway through the listing. By the time she reached the petition, her hands were flat on the table and she wasn't moving them. I didn't know, she said. Her voice was almost no voice at all. I believe you, I said, and I did. The colour had left her face and that's not something you perform. Mom, she pressed her fingers over her mouth. Mom, I know, I'm so sorry. I know that too. We sat there for a long time. The cardinal was back in the hydrangeas. I'd put the kettle on before she arrived and I got up and made us both tea, chamomile for her because of the baby, and I put a cup in front of her and sat back down. What are you going to do? She asked. I've already done most of it, I said. Beverly has the cease and desist filed. The listing is being pulled. The diminished capacity petition, I paused. Kezia, I have documentation from my doctor, from Beverly, from my accountant, from every institution I work with. There is not a judge in this state who is going to look at what he filed and see anything but what it is. She looked at the table. Which is what? Elder financial abuse, I said. That's what Beverly is calling it. That's what it is. The word abuse sat in the room between us for a moment. He told me, Kezia said slowly, that he'd been talking to you about the house, that you'd both been thinking it made sense to consolidate. He said you'd agreed in principle. I hung up on him, I said. The one time he called me about it, 11:47 on a Thursday night. She closed her eyes. Kezia. I waited until she opened them again. I'm not asking you to choose. I want to be very clear about that. You're my daughter, and you're having a baby, and none of that changes. But I need you to understand what happened here with no version of it except the true one. She nodded. She was crying now, quietly the way she'd cried as a child when she was too tired to make a sound. What do I do? She said. That's up to you, I said. But whatever you decide with clear eyes. That's all I ask. I'm going to skip over the legal part in detail because Beverly handled it and Beverly was magnificent, and I don't want to make this into a courtroom procedural when it isn't one. What I'll tell you is that the petition was dismissed. The listing was pulled. Spencer Walsh's firm issued a letter clarifying that the listing had been posted in error. Rodney hired his own attorney, briefly, and then stopped, presumably when that attorney explained to him what he was actually facing. What I will tell you is this. Kezia had her baby in April, a boy, 7 pounds 4 ounces, perfect in every particular. She named him Walter James after my late husband and her own father. She came home to a small house she'd rented in my neighbourhood, just her and the baby, and she's been there since. She and Rodney are separated. I don't know what they'll decide in the end, and I've been careful not to push her either direction. She is my daughter and I love her and she is figuring out her life. And the kindest thing I can do is be here when she needs me and give her room when she doesn't. I see the baby twice a week. He has Walter's ears and my mother's stubbornness, and he smells the way all babies smell, like something new just beginning. I want to say something because I think it's the part people need to hear most. I could have signed that deed. I know that sounds absurd, but there were moments in those weeks, lying awake, listening to the house breathe around me, when I thought about how much easier it would have been. Kezia was pregnant. I didn't want a war. I didn't want to be the reason my grandchild came into a broken home. There's a version of me who would have told herself it was generous, who would have called it love. But I kept coming back to something my mother told me. sitting in that guest room in the last weeks of her life. She said, "Lorraine, the problem with people who take is they never stop. You give them something, they come back for the next thing. The only way to stop a taker is to not give. My mother was a woman who rented her whole life and died with nothing to her name. She knew what she was talking about. I am 63 years old. I own my home. I have a grandson named Walter James who is going to learn to ride a bike in my driveway one day, the same driveway his mother rode hers in, and I intend to be standing right there when he does. And every spring, without fail, my mother's hydrangeas bloom along the back fence. Blue as anything remind me that what we plant and tend and love doesn't just belong to us. It belongs to everyone who comes after. Nobody gets to take that. Nobody."